with you guys as well. So I'm going to do a little intro on myself, who I am, kind of my background, and then the meat of the presentation today is I'd like to give you guys some tools to understand your health and your fitness. And I think blood work is one of those tools that seems complex. It seems like the realm of healthcare professionals and doctors, and in some ways it very much is, but I don't think it's so complex that the average person can't understand it. And so I'd like you guys to walk away from this presentation today with a couple tools in your hip pocket to understand kind of three big facets of your health. And so we'll dive into that in just a moment. And so we'll keep it a little bit loose today. If you guys have questions, feel free to just drop those in the chat here, and I'll try and address them as they go by, and then we'll have a little dedicated time for Q&A at the end here. So first of all, who am I? I'm a fitness guy. I've been in the industry about 15 years. I came out of corporate healthcare consulting about 15 years ago, which, by the way, I developed an acute allergy to putting slide decks together while I was doing consulting. So forgive me for how bad this slide deck is, for those of you that do this for a living. Came out of corporate healthcare, opened a gym, and I've done some fun stuff since. Run a bunch of different companies. I've gotten into a bunch of different facets of fitness, including deep into the nutrition space, done some movement expert stuff with the Navy SEALs, led nutrition programs with healthcare companies and corporate clients, things like that. But what I do now is I provide tools for normal people to really optimize their health and their fitness and look and feel exactly how they want. Because I think there's a lot of dogma in the health and fitness space. It's very confusing when you get into social media and do this, don't do that, and these two things you should be doing. It's a mess. And so I like to give people the real tools that really move the needle and help people prioritize what's going to give them the biggest bang for their buck in terms of effort. That's my background. What is the context for blood work that we're going to be talking about today? So I think of blood work as a way that you can understand what's going on under the hood. And the broader context of this is if you were to go in and say, go to your primary care physician and do an annual physical, typically what happens, and there are some more savvy doctors than this, but what typically happens, they run a comprehensive metabolic panel, they run a complete blood count, those are blood tests. They don't tell you much. They might weigh you, they might do your blood pressure and send you on your way. And this is not helpful because what they're checking for is disease. And what most of us are interested in is not disease, but rather, how are we doing with regard to the aging process, and how is our fitness and our health tracking from year to year? And I think there's a better way to approach this. And the context within which I want to present blood work is this. What is an ideal annual physical? Like, what is a good set of metrics you can run on an annual basis that gives you real actionable feedback? And I think it is this. First and foremost, body composition. And so like what kind of muscle mass are you dealing with? How much body fat do you have? What's your bone mineral density? And the bone mineral density is a little bit less critical for men. We run into fewer problems with this, although I think that's going to change with the prevalence of GLP-1s on the market right now. And without going too deep into that, GLP-1s are wonder drugs for people that need them, but they can be a really Faustian bargain for people that don't. And so the more muscle you have, the less body fat that you're packing, the longer you're going to live and the higher your quality of life, generally speaking. So I think body composition is a great place to start. This can be in-body, which is a bioimpedance test. It can be DEXA scan, which is kind of the gold standard in the industry for body composition. But we start there. So how much muscle you got? What's your body fat percentage? And then we move to, say, like a physical capacity test. And a physical capacity test, you can think of this in a few different ways. But the primary goal is like, what can you do? And this can be like a military PFT. It could be like a CrossFit benchmark workout. Something that incorporates a combination of like aerobic capacity and strength and mobility would be good. But I think we would all agree that like a workout, if you're doing well at working out and you function well, that's a good indicator as far as like health and lifespan. So that's part number two. And then part number three of this annual physical would be blood work. And I think you can understand a lot about what's going on under the hood from blood work. And this is an area where we want to get ahead of the curve because 86% of Americans are going to die from chronic disease. And chronic disease sucks because it's miserable while you have it, and then it will kill you. And so we'd like to avoid this thing. But the catch is we have to start avoiding chronic disease decades before you would actually be diagnosed. And that gets a little bit difficult if you're thinking using the old medical rubric of diagnose disease, treat disease, because we want to figure this out way before you get it. So what are some of the things that you can figure out from blood work? Well, we're going to go through metabolic health today. We're going to talk about lipids a little bit because I think that one is misunderstood. And we're going to talk a little bit about hormonal health. You can also understand kidney and liver function. You can get into blood counts. You can get into inflammatory markers. You can understand a lot through blood work. But we're going to hit three big categories today where you guys can start to understand what's going on under the hood and translate this into actions you can take to really move the needle, not just to improve how you look and feel, but your risk for chronic disease down the road, and give you something tangible where you can change the numbers and be like, okay, I'm doing really well. Or you can take a look at your tests and say, wow, it's been a tough year. You know, had little kids, or I've been focused on my career or something like that, and things have slipped. And you can see that slip early and course correct. So let's go ahead and get into it. The first area, and this is, I think, one of the most critical areas that you can understand your health, is metabolic health. What is metabolic health? So metabolic health is your body's ability to both store and liberate fuel for energy. And so you can talk about this through a bunch of different lenses. You may have heard of like insulin resistance. That's metabolic health. Metabolic health also relates to, you know, the body composition conversation around body fat and lean muscle mass. Typically, the lower body fat you have and the higher lean muscle mass, the better your metabolic health. But this is kind of the precursor to all the big diseases none of us want, all the stuff we're trying to get away from. And all of these diseases are complex in what causes them, meaning there is not just a single variable involved here, but metabolic health is involved in almost all of them. And I think we all saw this during the COVID pandemic, where those that had poor metabolic health really fared poorly when they got COVID. And those that had excellent metabolic health tend to do really well. And so I think that's a good indicator for chronic disease risk. If you want to stay away from type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, the neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia, and a lot of the cancers have a basis in metabolic disease, this is where we start. And so I think there's three legs to this stool, to the metabolic health stool. And these come in different tests. There's not just a metabolic health test. Typically, like your fasting blood glucose usually comes in a comprehensive metabolic panel. Triglycerides comes in a lipid panel, and your HbA1c is a specific test that you would get independent of those. But these three together will give us a good idea of how well you're storing fuel and liberating fuel for energy. So let's talk about this. The primary premise here is we don't want fuel in the bloodstream. If you haven't just eaten and you're not exercising, we don't want fuel in the bloodstream. And if there is fuel in the bloodstream, that tells us we're having trouble storing fuel. And this is a good indicator that we're on a bad road towards one of these diseases listed there. So fasting blood glucose. So blood glucose is, just as it says, what is the sugar in the bloodstream at the moment? And so this is kind of a spot test of like, hey, right now, how much sugar is in your bloodstream? And we want this to be low. So standard reference range for fasting blood glucose is under 100 milligrams per deciliter. And so if you're under 100, that's generally considered good by the medical community. And I would happen to agree with that. I think 70 to 90 milligrams per deciliter is optimal. That's where we want you. So if you're like 98, 99, technically passes underneath that bar, but we'd like you a little bit lower. I want to caveat that fasting blood glucose is fickle. And there are a lot of things that can kind of throw this one off a little bit and can make otherwise very healthy people test high, which is why we have the two other legs of this three-legged stool here. So fasting blood glucose, we want well away from 100. And the second one is triglycerides. And triglycerides, where blood glucose is sugar in the bloodstream, triglycerides is fat in the bloodstream. And it's a spot test. And so it's like, okay, what is the fat run around your bloodstream right now? And the standard reference range would say, as long as you're under 150, you're okay. And I disagree with that a little bit. I think optimal is under 100. And this is really common for the clients that I work with, is once we get them eating the right food and exercising well and sleeping well and doing kind of all these pieces, they typically drop well under 100. And so if you're up in the 130s, 140s, your physician might say, yep, you're fine. And I would say maybe there's some risk there. So under 100, I think, is optimal for triglycerides. And that's fat in the bloodstream. Now, the last of the three-legged stool here is HbA1c. And this is also called hemoglobin A1c. And this is an interesting test because I mentioned that fasting blood glucose is fickle and it can be thrown off a little bit by things. HbA1c is not fickle. It is a 90-day retrospective of what your average blood sugar has been. And so you can eat a box of donuts right before you have your blood drawn, and this one would not change. So the standard reference range here is 5.6%. And so if you're above 5.6%, you're getting into pre-diabetic territory or high enough. This is actually HbA1c is how they diagnose type 2 diabetes. And so if you're above 5.6%, we're in a troubled spot. That means that your average blood sugar has been too high. Now, why is that problematic? Well, blood sugar running around your cardiovascular system is actually really damaging. Chronic high blood sugar is toxic and is going to damage your arterial and your capillary system and causes tons of problems. So we want your average blood sugar to be low. And I would say under 5.4% is really the golden spot to be. So if you were at like 5.6, 5.5, I would call that okay. And there's no pre-diabetic diagnosis there. But if you're under 5.4, we know that you're utilizing carbohydrates really well and your average blood sugar is in a good spot. So what's the fix? Let's say that one or several of these is out of whack. You get your blood tested and you're outside of the optimal zones. The fixes are simple, maybe not easy, but they're simple. Consume less processed foods and carbohydrates. That's a great place to start. That's going to start to fix metabolic health. Some regular exercise, bias particularly towards some resistance training, and a little bit less towards the chronic cardio can be really helpful. And then even things like getting better quality of sleep can really improve metabolic health. There's also some supplementation that can help here, but it's primarily eat single ingredient foods like meats, vegetables, fruits, get some regular lifting in, and get some better sleep. Moving on to the next set of blood tests here. So this is one I think is widely misunderstood, is lipids. And so lipids is cholesterol. What does your cholesterol look like? And I think there's this common idea that high cholesterol is bad. And this goes all the way back. The lipid hypothesis of atherosclerosis started with a guy named Ansel Keys a long time ago and was well-intentioned, but I think misguided. And that hypothesis was that if we eat dietary cholesterol, that dietary cholesterol builds up in our arteries and that causes heart attacks. I don't think that I believe that at this point. There doesn't seem to be the evidence to support that. I think it's a little bit more complex than that. And so what we're seeing is high cholesterol plus metabolic disease or other forms of inflammation, by the way, and that can come from things like smoking. Smoking cigarettes is problematic because it just floods your body with inflammation. High cholesterol plus inflammation or metabolic disease is going to give you a heart attack. That's bad. Low cholesterol is very clearly the most deadly thing you can have. And so low cholesterol is really bad. Why is that? Well, because cholesterol is just not just problematic in your arteries, it's actually a very good thing for the rest of your body. All your hormones are synthesized from cholesterol. Cholesterol makes up the cell walls of all the cells in your body. Most of the dry weight of your brain is cholesterol. Cholesterol makes up your skin, your hair, your nails. Cholesterol is necessary. Cholesterol is a really good thing. In fact, all the centenarians in the world, everybody that lives over 100 years old seems to have sky-high cholesterol. So cholesterol is not the single factor we want to look at here. We don't want low cholesterol. We don't want high cholesterol with a bunch of inflammation. So what do we want? We want high cholesterol with low inflammation. And while I do think we're going to see some pretty good research come out in the next 20 years around this conversation gets skewed quite a bit because now we have a multi-billion-dollar industry selling statins to lower cholesterol that it doesn't seem like is a great way to prevent. It's not a great way to do primary prevention, which means avoid your first heart attack. So that's why the conversation gets a little bit skewed around this. Now, two things that you can take a look at in your cholesterol test, HDL and LDL. So high density lipoprotein, low density lipoprotein. HDL, your doc's going to call that the good cholesterol. And we want to drive that as high as we can. And so I think over 60 milligrams per deciliter is optimal. They're typically going to be okay with over 40. And I think we can go higher than that. I think over 60 is really where we want you for the HDL numbers. And the LDL numbers is the low density lipoprotein. This is commonly called bad cholesterol. And I'm not sure that that's a good name for it, because what we've learned recently is that it's not as easy as more bad cholesterol equals bad outcomes. Like more LDL doesn't mean more heart attacks. It's more complex than that. There's a big meta-analysis done. Meta-analysis just means they looked at all the studies that are out there, and they did a study of all the studies. And they tried to draw some conclusions about all-cause mortality, which just means dying from anything. So the all-cause mortality risk and LDL is where they tried to drive some relationships. And what they found is there's the big sweet spot for LDL, and that's between 100 to 189 milligrams per deciliter. That's where, if you're in there and your metabolic health is good, I think you're at low risk. This is going to freak out your physician, because if you're over 100 milligrams per deciliter, your physician is probably going to start recommending a statin to you. And your doctor is well-intentioned and very, very well-read, but the problem is they have only a pharmaceutical view on these things. All they know is pharmaceutical intervention. They're not taught dietary or exercise intervention for this stuff. And they're taught that the more LDL, the more heart attacks. And I think that's probably about 40 years out of date at this point, which it's worth mentioning that statins for the right person might be a good choice, but they are not a cost-free medication. They have lots of side effects associated with them, and they should not be taken lightly. I think you should really understand the situation you're in before you start taking the statin. It's not can't hurt, I'll just take it and hopefully it helps. It can hurt in a lot of areas and raise some risk for chronic disease, like diabetes. It can lower testosterone levels, and it can cause muscle and joint pain in some people. Okay, so you get your lipids run. They're out of whack. Let's say your HDL is low. You're down in the 30s or 40s for HDL. Your LDL is over 200. Oh my, what do we do? Well, you're going to see some themes here, but the dietary fix is relatively straightforward. So we want to get less processed food. We want to eat a good deal of high quality dietary fat. And so the places where we like to get dietary fat from are monounsaturated plant sources like olives and olive oil, avocados and avocado oil. Coconut is fantastic. Nuts and nut butters are great. And here's where the science has changed over the last 40 years is we used to think that saturated fat from animal sources was going to cause heart disease. We now know that that is not the case, that saturated fat is actually totally acceptable and is not going to drive chronic disease risk up quite a bit. And if you take a look back at some of the tribal populations, I think there's an interesting lens to look at this stuff through, like the Inuit. So the Inuit population is interesting in that their diet before the introduction of westernized foods was a little bit of protein, a phenomenal amount of saturated fat, and very little to any carbohydrates. And it was seasonal at best. And it was only during the summertime they would get a little bit of carbohydrates. Absolutely no heart disease, no chronic disease whatsoever until you started to introduce processed westernized foods. So we know that saturated fat itself is not going to cause heart attack. But if we introduce metabolic disease, that starts to cause problems. Exercise can also be super helpful here. And I think for most men in our demographic, like middle-aged, 30s, 40s, 50s, a significant dose of lifting weights, a little bit of cardio here and there is excellent. And then lots of low-intensity activity like walking and things like that. So that's lipids. Let's talk about hormonal health a little bit. And before we dive into that, let me just take a quick breath. Does anybody have any questions on any of this stuff so far? And right back to it. So hormonal health can be a complex thing. So we're going to talk about two pieces of hormonal health here. So we're going to talk about vitamin D and testosterone. Vitamin D is actually a misnomer. Vitamin D is a hormone, which is why it ends up on this slide. And testosterone is kind of the big one. So let's talk about vitamin D and testosterone. So vitamin D, we're talking about these two because they're important, and the vitamin D is super easy to fix. Testosterone is a little bit more challenging to fix, but both are important. So vitamin D we typically get from the sun. And so, UV radiation hits our skin. We synthesize vitamin D from the sunlight, and that's how we typically get natural vitamin D. But most of us work in offices. We tend not to get the same sun exposure that we would if we were in a pre-industrialized society. And so vitamin D levels are chronically low across the board. Why is this a problem? Well, immune function is one of the big things that we get from vitamin D. So I've got an 8-month-old, and he started daycare in January. And that was brutal, man. Talk about a little petri dish. Like, he brought everything home. I was sick for like 2 months straight. Now it's getting quite a bit better. But if we're looking for better vitamin or better immune function, vitamin D is where to get it. Also implicated in things like muscle health and soft tissue health. So I had an athlete at my gym back in the day who was super fit. He ate incredibly clean, got great sleep, took great care of himself, was in good shape, but he kept getting these little muscle pulls over and over and over that would interrupt his training. We tested his blood work, and his vitamin D came back super low. I think he might have been in like the low double digits. And so we raised his vitamin D levels, and these muscle pulls stopped happening. Long story short, where we want vitamin D is about 60 to 80 nanograms per deciliter. So the standard reference range is going to say 30 to 100. And so 60 to 80 is really the sweet spot. This is where we start getting great benefits from the vitamin D that you're getting. And this one is a super easy fix. You can supplement it very effectively. Vitamin D3 plus K2 is a great way to get it. So the D3, we're going to take 5,000 IU a day during the summertime. And I say in the summertime, if you've got like a nice light tan going on, you're getting enough sun exposure that 5,000 IU a day is probably going to get you there. 10,000 IU a day in the wintertime, or if you test low. So if you test below 60 nanograms per deciliter, I throw 10,000 IU a day at it. Vitamin D is super cheap. And then as far as sun exposure, try and stay away from the sunscreens if you can, if you need it. Stick to the mineral-based sunscreens that have physical blockers in them. And then titrate up your healthy sun exposure. So, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour. Slowly titrate up your sun exposure, and you'll be able to handle more and more sun exposure throughout the summer. A little bit of supplementation with it works really well. By the way, the reason we pair vitamin K2 with D3 is if you're running high levels of supplemented vitamin D3, there is a small risk of vectoring some calcium out of your bones and into your cardiovascular system. This is bad. We don't want it. Arterial calcification is an indication of heart disease, but it's a super easy fix. If you get a supplement that has a paired D3 and K2, the ratios are already done for you, and that eliminates all of that risk. So D3, very easy to supplement with, and cost per benefit is huge. Austin, by the way, I see your question. Let's chat about that in the Q&A in just a moment here. So let's talk testosterone for a moment. And so I'm leaving this one for last because if you could only do one blood test on kind of our demographic of men, 30s, 40s, maybe into the 50s, you could only do one test and you wanted to assess their entire quality of life. This is the test. Your overall testosterone levels are going to tell you a lot about your ability to put on lean muscle mass. It's going to tell you what your energy is like, how well you're sleeping. It has big implications for your attitude and how you're feeling, levels of confidence and things like that. Of course, libido is involved here, athletic performance. There's a lot of quality of life stuff wrapped in testosterone. And I like this one as a singular test because it's also going to have implications for what is your metabolic health? How well are you sleeping? What are your stress levels? Are they well managed at the moment? What are your exercise routines like? All of this is wrapped into testosterone. What we're looking for here is for our demographics, and this is age specific because testosterone is going to drop as you get older, but we'd like to be over 600 nanograms per deciliter as total testosterone. We want to be in the 600s. 500s is good. Over 600s is better. 800 is great. The higher, the better. And there is a wide range of this stuff that happens. There's some genetic implications here. So genetically, some people have higher levels than other people, but behavior is one of the big things that drives this. More testosterone is better. Like I had a client I was talking to yesterday, and he's mid 30s, super hard charger. He's in the finance world. He's got a 4-month-old, and he's had a ton of stress in his life lately. He's not sleeping super great. He's down in the 200s, and I feel for that guy, because being in the 200s, total testosterone is miserable. So what we're going to do with him is we're going to try and push a high protein, low processed food diet, make sure that he's getting enough fuel. We're going to encourage him to get more and better quality sleep. Tough with the little one, but when you can get it, we're going to try and get it. We're going to back him off of the high intensity interval training and the CrossFit that he loves for the meantime. And don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-CrossFit. Ran a CrossFit gym for a long time. But in the meantime, more resistance training, less cardio is going to push this testosterone level higher. And we're going to manage the stress. We got to figure out how we can take this very demanding professional career of his, having a young one at home. How are we going to manage his stress? Now, we're going to try and push his testosterone levels as high as we can. And so he was down in the 200s. We're going to try and double that. We're going to try and get him over 500. And if we can't get him here naturally, then that's the situation where a conversation about TRT, I think, makes a lot of sense. And so you want to try and stay off of TRT as long as you can, just because there can be some complications. Primarily, once you get on that train of testosterone replacement therapy, it's hard to get off. Now, that being said, for the people that it is appropriate for, it can be just night and day. Quality of life changes are enormous. So if you need TRT and there's a good reason for you to be on it, it can be incredibly powerful, and it can be done very safely for a long term. I work with lots of athletes and clients that are doing TRT. We try and push that as late into their life as they can. And then once it becomes appropriate, it becomes appropriate. And so I think testosterone is a big one. And so if you take nothing else away from this conversation, I would say pay attention to your blood markers, particularly testosterone. That will tell you how well you're aging. So let me dive into a couple questions we got in the chat here. So one about supplements like Tongkat Ali. I think that supplement is an herbal that I think got popular because Huberman talked about it a while back. And somebody check me on that. There was another one as well. He recommended pairing Tongkat Ali with another one that is escaping my mind right now. And I think there is, when I looked into it, there is some data that some of these herbals can help support testosterone, but the amount of change that you're going to get for some of these supplements tends to not be impressive compared to changes in lifestyle. And so changes in lifestyle are a little bit more complex to implement. Getting more sleep can be challenging, like when you got a career and a social life and a wife you want to spend time with, and you know, all this other stuff. But the big changes are going to happen around changing what you eat, changing your stress levels and how much you're sleeping, and changing how you train. So can there be some supplements that help with testosterone? Yeah, for the right crowd, I would say get the big building blocks in place first, like get your food right, get your training right, get your sleep right. And then there's a little opportunity to dabble with some of these other supplements. The supplements that I think would come first are things like magnesium and zinc and vitamin D. I think those are going to be your most powerful upstream contributors to testosterone levels. Whereas some of these others, like some of these herbal extracts and things like that, yeah, there's some science that suggests they might have some positive effect here, but I don't think you're going to be impressed by the magnitude of change by taking those things. There was something else I was going to say about testosterone that was going to move the needle here. I reserve the right to come back to it in a moment if it comes to me. So back to one of the earlier slides. So Austin asked, what are some questions about your PCP when they want to put you on a statin? Well, I think first and foremost is recognize that your doctor is trying to help. And doctors are smart people, but they are trained in this methodology of diagnose disease, treat disease. And so when they give you a statin, that is the tool that they have available to help you avoid cardiovascular disease, because doctors are not taught nutrition in medical school. They're not taught exercise in medical school. They don't know how sleep affects these things. So they have big blind spots for some of the holistic factors here. And so what I have had some of my clients do is, as they're dialing in their food, their sleep, their training through my coaching and my programs, their doctor's like, hey, your LDL's high, we got to put you on a statin. They have requested an arterial calcium scan. And so the arterial calcium scan is it can show some precursors for heart disease. And they're like, if I test high on an arterial calcium scan, I'll consider the statin. Even if that's a bit of a white lie in the moment and they're not interested in the statin, they'll say that. The doctor will order an arterial calcium scan. And so far, and this is small sample size, of course, because I've worked with hundreds of people, not tens of thousands. So far, those arterial calcium scans come back perfect. They come back zero. And there's zero risk for heart disease. And it kind of leaves the physician going, okay, I'll leave you off of it for now. So I think, one, asking for the arterial calcium scan is a good next step. I think having a coach kind of walk you through your other risk factors, like what is your metabolic health look like? What are your stress levels? Is there anything else in your blood work that shows risk for cardiac event? And then I would ask your doctor things like, what are the statistics around primary prevention in statins? Primary prevention just mean avoiding your first heart attack. And then what are the risk factors? Because statins can cause a higher risk for type 2 diabetes. They can cause muscle and joint pain. They can cause other things like that. So we're not sure statins are super effective, and there's some costs associated with them. So I think really understanding your risk for cardiovascular disease. You could even go deeper. There's a thing called an NMR, which takes a look at lipids, your cholesterol. It takes a look at your cholesterol counts and particle size. And that's a much more specific test, and there's some predictive value in that for cardiac disease. So those are some routes that you can go if your primary care physician is talking about statins. Another question in the chat here. So for vitamin D and other supplements, any specific brands to look for or stay away from? Good question. So I work with some specific brands of supplements, and how I found those brands is they are third-party tested, and they publish their COAs, their certificates of analysis, online. Why is this important? Well, the biggest risk that you're going to get in supplements is not that there's going to be something dangerous in the supplement. That tends to be quite rare. It does happen, but it's rare. The biggest problem with supplements is they don't contain the amount of the active ingredient that is on the bottle. And so they did a study where they took vitamin D off the shelf. They just bought them at a drugstore, and they did a mass spectrometer on them, and they told you what was in them. And they ended up with between 30% and 150% of what was on the label was actually in the supplement. And the way around this to figure that out is find companies that pay for third-party testing. That means a separate company tests their supplements, and then they post their certificates of analysis online. And so that's a great way to jump in and see, okay, what are their quality standards, and are they meeting those quality standards? And if they publish their third-party testing, they're not going to publish that, and they're not going to pay for it if they're not meeting those standards. Why does this happen? Well, there's a common process in the supplement world where a supplement company will do really well and gain a bunch of followers and do really well from a business aspect, and they'll get bought by a private equity firm or a VC firm, and that firm will change their formulations, change the source ingredients, and kind of gut the company. And what once was a really high quality supplement company will end up lower quality. And the way around that is just know what's in your supplements. Second, Peter Attia's book. So Dr. Peter Attia, the book we're talking about is Outlive. I strongly recommend it. It's a great read. I agree with like 95% of it. Dr. Peter Attia is an awesome dude, very intelligent, has all the tools of a medical doctor behind him, and has kind of moved out into the longevity and the fitness space. And generally speaking, I think he's a super smart guy doing great work, and has published books, which I have not yet. So he's done all sorts of things I haven't yet. I have a ton of respect for him. He mentions ApoB when getting lipid panels. Yes, so you can kind of go down this rabbit hole quite a bit here. I'm not sure that I'm fully on board with the way he is assessing cardiac risk in his book. That being said, he has some experience that I don't. So while we disagree here, that's a place where I'd love to have a discussion with him around some of these blood markers. I'm not sure. I would take my recommendations. I would read his book, Outlive, and I would say formulate your own opinions around that, because I don't want to directly disagree with him because he has some experience in education. I don't. That being said, I'm not sure that I'm fully on board with believing his exact way of testing for cardiac risk and some of these subgroups of lipids. There may be something there. I'm not sure that I'm a firm believer in some of the behavioral things he recommends to get away from to change your blood lipids. So that's a quick overview here, guys. If you got other questions, pop them in the chat here. But a quick review, if we're taking a look at, starting out with metabolic health, the first three, fasting blood glucose, triglycerides, HbA1c, these are going to tell you a great deal about your metabolic risk for disease. Lipids. Cholesterol is not bad. We want to avoid inflammation, and we want to avoid things being really out of whack. We want to avoid low HDL. We want to avoid either super low or super high LDL, and this is coming from food, primarily carbohydrates and processed carbohydrates, not saturated fat. That's not the problem. And then lastly, looking at hormonal health, supplement your vitamin D. If you don't know where your vitamin D level is at, start with 5,000 IU a day right now, and then schedule your vitamin D test. And then let's track testosterone. What's my take on electrolytes? Making sure we're not missing hydration by drinking tap water. Thank you for the prompt. This was the piece I was going to talk about around testosterone. Fluoride is common in our drinking waters. Fluoride is going to suppress testosterone levels. And so, getting an RO filter or reverse osmosis filter on your house, or I just have, bottled spring water delivered to the house that's fluoride free. Changing that out can be a huge boost to testosterone levels. As far as hydration goes, electrolytes are big. The most important electrolyte is salt, sodium. Sodium is the biggest electrolyte that we've got. We need a bare minimum some sodium in your drinking water. I like electrolyte supplements that combine sodium, magnesium, and potassium. Those are kind of the big three. They're not the only three, but those are the big three electrolytes that allows the water that you drink to be assimilated into your cells and provide actual hydration. Whereas if we're just drinking purified water, a lot of that water tends to just pass right through us because it doesn't look like the water in your cells. If you think about it, getting an IV, you would never get like a pure water IV in a hospital. That's always saline. Why? Saline looks like the fluid that's in your cells. So saline is just water and salt. So yeah, there's lots of good brands out here doing good work. I use Salty, SALTT. I use Element right now. And there's a bunch of others. There's a lot of right answers there. Redmond, I think, makes some really good supplement packets as well. But getting some sodium in your drinking water can really help out. Guys, happy to take some more questions here, but some final thoughts. Of course, if Adam is okay with it, I'm going to shoot you guys an email after the call here with some follow-up stuff. I'll send you the slide deck just so you have the reference ranges that we talked about here in that as well. I also wrote a blog post that goes a little bit more in depth and into some other blood tests. So I'll send a link to that as well so you have the reference ranges available to you. And that blog post is important because there are links at the bottom of it where you can run your own blood work if you want to. And so you don't need a doctor to run your blood work. All the full blood panel that I typically recommend for clients is about, I think, $230, $250 maybe. And then if you run all that stuff and you want me to interpret it for you, reach out. I'm happy to do that and interpret your blood results for you. And then if something kind of pops and you're curious and you want to go deeper, or maybe you're interested in taking action, not just on blood work, but also how you look and feel, or dialing in your fitness routine to change some things in your life, I run something called the Holistic Transformation Program. And we teach people all of the powerful components necessary to get all of that under control. So my contact information is here. Feel free to reach out with any questions that you have, and I'm happy to help. I appreciate you guys taking the time to be on the call today.